opportunity to address all of you. So the presentation will be delivered in English, but I'm more than happy to answer questions in French si jamais il y a du monde qui souhaite poser leurs questions en français. I'd like to begin with the University of Ottawa's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. I am joining from Ottawa on the University of Ottawa, which is here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and this is our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. I would encourage everybody to recognize and acknowledge the land from which they're joining us today. And I find this land acknowledgement, particularly meaningful in the context of so many horrific discoveries of unmarked graves across the country of children at Indigenous residential schools. And I'm wearing this orange scarf to remember and recognize that, and hope that we continue to be aware of all of these really challenging issues in Canada's past and present, and work towards reconciliation. So I'd like to just underscore the importance of the event. I was not able to participate in the simulation. I hope those of you who did really enjoyed themselves. This is so important, and I really congratulate Science and Policy Exchange for working with YASA and others to pull this together. So important in terms of training and professional development for emerging scientists and others who are keen to engage in science diplomacy and learn more about science diplomacy. I think it's also a great illustration of the importance and value of partnerships and collaboration. The ISSP is absolutely delighted to help support this event. So excited to do so. And it's also, of course, important in terms of the content matter as well. Addressing climate change couldn't be one of the more important challenges of our time. And I think, simulations and the role of simulations and exploring the way in which those help us to learn more about being in worlds that maybe we're not in when it comes to diplomacy, for example. So this is really about, the keynote today, and I'm going to start sharing my screen in a moment. My keynote focuses in on the way in which science diplomacy can help us to transform decision-making for the grand challenges of our time. I really wish we could be doing this in person. I would make it very interactive and would be asking you lots of questions about your experience with the simulation, but it's a little more difficult to do that virtually. So I'll just move through the material, and then we can get to a discussion and a Q&A session. So this idea of, transforming decision-making for the grand challenges of our time, this is foursquare within the mandate and new strategic vision of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. For those who aren't familiar with us, Seychri mentioned, I'm the director of the ISSP at the University of Ottawa. We're a cross-faculty institute that looks at the interface between science, society, and policy. We have multiple members, across many faculties at the university, a variety of other partners and members beyond campus as well, across the country and internationally. And our strategic vision for the next 5 years is a bold one, and I think it's in line with SPE's new strategic vision as well, which is to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. So the work that we're doing in terms of our research, our teaching and training, our outreach is really about, helping to identify how we can better bridge and align science, society, and policy imperatives. And that's, in terms of things like strengthening relationships within and among academia, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society, which is very much what the simulation was focused in on today, and certainly what science diplomacy focuses in on. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll walk you through where I plan to take the talk. Okay. Let me just turn on the actual presentation, and then Seyshri, you can let me know if this is working. Great. And are you seeing it in presenter mode or in audience mode?
Audience mode.
Okay, great, because I'm
Yes.
seeing it in presenter mode. We had a bit of a test run before the session, so this is great. All right, so the topic of the talk, as I mentioned, is about transforming decision making, but it's really about looking at the science of science diplomacy. So kind of taking a step back to better understand science diplomacy. And I hope that this will give you a bit of a frame for the experience that you just had with the simulation. The keynote itself is going to run through a variety of different topic areas. We're going to be talking about grand challenges and the way in which they really require science diplomacy to be effectively addressed. Then I'm going to be getting into the science of science diplomacy, specifically through the teaching and training lens, but also in terms of theories and models. And I'll give you a small example of that. And then it's going to end with some thoughts in terms of looking forward. What can we do to really mobilize and catalyze and maximize the capacity for science diplomacy to help us to address grand challenges? So let's start with grand challenges and science diplomacy. There are so many grand challenges that we have to deal with collectively as a society, whether domestically or globally. And certainly today, your focus was on climate change, but take your pick. There's COVID-19, emerging and disruptive technologies, so many different areas that really require bringing together science, society, and policy issues and objectives and interests, both domestically, but also globally. And the work that we've been doing at the Institute really underscores the importance of the way in which addressing grand challenges is about collaboration. It's about working together to forge solutions that are going to work when it comes to addressing issues from a public policy and broader societal perspective. And that's really hard to do. Right? This is not an easy thing to do. We've got rapid technological change, lots of uncertainty. We have polarization that we're dealing with in some areas, energy and climate change included. We have mistrust or trust that can be in flux when it comes to trust in government and other key decision makers, and also growing expectations on the part of citizens to be involved in decision making. People want to be involved in decisions that affect them. And so how do we then go about kind of aligning all of this so that we're all pulling in the same direction or pushing in the same direction to address these grand challenges? And there are multiple ways we can go about doing this. And this talk focuses in specifically on science diplomacy and the way in which science diplomacy can help us in that regard. So what is science diplomacy? So being an academic, of course, I start with definitions. The first one that you can note here by Modzui and Gual-Soller, this was a very recent definition, very broad. All of the processes that inform or influence international relations in science and technology. So, on the one hand, this is about science and technology. On the other hand, it's about international relations. And so these authors, they talk about, the science piece, which of course is, not only the natural sciences and engineering and the health sciences, but also the social sciences and humanities. It's basic and applied science, it's technology and innovation. So it's quite a broad, definition. And then they also talk about diplomacy, of course, because that's the other piece of science diplomacy. And this maybe for, a number of you might be a little bit, sort of new material or new ground. And so Berridge defines this as the art and practice of conducting international relations between governments through dialogue, negotiation, and cooperation. And there are just a couple of things I want to underscore here. I think the first is to note this first word, art. And what, the reason that we often talk about art when we're referring to diplomacy is that, this is not a hard science in the sense of there's a mathematical formula. If you just learn it, you'll be a great diplomat. There is an art to diplomacy in terms of negotiation, relationship building, trust building, and the like. Because at the international level, there is no world government. So there is no, government that can say, okay, globe, we're going to do X, Y, Z now. So much of the work that happens globally has to, because of that, happen through negotiation between governments, through dialogue and cooperation. And so as a result of that, diplomacy is hard work, and there's a lot of learning in terms of the art and practice of that, what's often referred to as a craft. A second definition of science diplomacy, and this gets to the comment I made in the previous slide, is science diplomacy is being a field of study and practice that's looking at these linkages between science, technology, and international affairs, but particularly to address national and global challenges. And I think that's really what I want to bring forward in the talk today is the way in which science diplomacy can help us to do that. So let's kind of dig down a little bit deeper then. So what does science diplomacy encompass? For those of you who aren't familiar, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you're not familiar with this report here, New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, that was published about a decade ago, collaboration between the Royal Society of the UK and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is really a landmark piece. I'd highly recommend you to have a look at that if you're interested in science diplomacy. And, the report articulates three different kind of buckets, if you will, that we can think about science diplomacy in. One of which is science for diplomacy. So that's cooperation to improve relations between countries. And I think this is really interesting if you're a scientist to think about, because what this refers to is, particularly in contexts of crisis or conflict or emergency, post-war periods, some of these more challenging eras in international relations, that the relationships between the scientific community can actually represent sort of a common ground, a neutral ground, a way in which governments can build upon in terms of their broader relations. And I think, again, it's useful if you're a scientist to think through, is that instrumentalizing scientists, or is that something that the scientific community can actually do to help the globe and to help countries to cooperate and collaborate with one another? So that's science for diplomacy. Science in diplomacy, and this is very much, and I know we have evidence for democracy on the line today. This is very much about, evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making. So informing foreign policy objectives with science advice. So very much that science for policy piece of science diplomacy. And then the third bucket is diplomacy for science. So this is about, what can we do to promote or foster international scientific cooperation? And so what I'm adding to this three-part metric here today is the idea of the science of science diplomacy. So the idea of kind of taking a step back and looking at what are some of the models and theories and methods of science diplomacy practice, teaching, and training, with the aim, of course, about helping us and those of us who are interested in getting engaged in science diplomacy to kind of better think through how do we engage in this area. So I'm going to start by looking a little bit at teaching and training. There's been some really interesting work done around science diplomacy knowledge and skills. I think one of the things I would note is that there's relatively few training programs around science diplomacy. So again, kudos to SPE to work with other partners to pull this initiative together, because the simulation you just participated in is just a brilliant way of learning about science diplomacy. And there aren't as many opportunities to learn about science diplomacy, perhaps as we might like. And I'm going to come back to that at the end of the talk. So when it comes to teaching and training, what are some of the skills that can be learned? And so the article that's referenced here by Modzui and Gual-Soller, they talk about skills-based knowledge that not only should scientists learn, but also that diplomats should learn. So again, I know many of you are coming to this from a scientific perspective, but if you're a diplomat, you could be, you know, coming through the door of diplomacy through a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds, but find yourself working in a science diplomacy role. And so, you know, when it comes to the skills-based knowledge, it's not only thinking about what a scientist need to learn, but also what do diplomats need to learn. I'm not going to go through all of this in, you know, excruciating detail. I know you can all read this for yourself, but what I want to do is just point your attention to a few topic areas in terms of skills-based knowledge that I think are really perhaps useful for you to think about. I think the first is, you know, look at the very first, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but look at the very first entry underneath the scientist column, basic negotiation skills, for example, acquired through simulation games, which is what all of you have just done. So you have all just participated in a really premier way to learn about science diplomacy. And you'll see if you look down at these skills, which again, I'm not going to go through in detail here, but so much of what's in here is really about what people often think of as sort of soft skills around communication, presentation, persuasion, negotiation, relationship building, networking, and the like, because so much of what happens in science diplomacy really is about relationships. And I'm sure that you saw that, you know, close up in the simulation exercise. The other thing you probably saw close up in the simulation exercise is the second last entry here under the scientist column, which is, you know, how do you think about balancing, and maybe, you know, we could probably think of different words than balancing, but balancing scientific facts with competing interests and values of diverse stakeholders, right? So you've got political interests, economic interests, cultural interests, religious interests. Not everybody or everything is coming to science diplomacy and negotiations with a scientific background or with the science and scientific evidence, their sort of primary concern. And I think that's really challenging sometimes for scientists, but a very important skill to learn. If we look at the different skills-based knowledge under the diplomat column, there we see a lot of, you know, assisting those in the diplomatic corps to learn more about science and to learn, you know, have sort of basic scientific literacy in terms of their work with scientists and others in science diplomacy. So if we go then to content-based knowledge, and again, I'm not going to go through this in lots of detail. One thing I will just note to you, though, is that any of the writing in here that's in italics are things that I added in because I felt that they were important to, you know, to note as well. And, you know, again, you're not likely through a simulation to get all of this content-based knowledge. In fact, far from it. But I think it's really important in terms of identifying what are some of the kind of basic content issues that would be really useful, particularly if you're coming from the natural sciences and engineering or health sciences, to know about if you get engaged with science diplomacy. So this is, you know, the social sciences, humanities, international relations being extremely key. I think the second entry here is quite you know, useful to draw your attention to, you know, the culture, the values, and the timescales of diplomacy, right? So science itself, if you look to the counterpart entry in the second column, says culture, values, and timescales of science. You've got sort of different epistemological communities or epistemic communities that are coming together in science diplomacy, and learning about that I think is really crucial for those who are engaging in science diplomacy to get a better understanding of the kind of the culture, as it were, of diplomacy and the time frames that are utilized in that sector. A few other things that I would just draw your attention to. One here is international negotiation theory. And I'm going to be talking with you a little bit in a moment to give you an example of the way international negotiation theory, or a particular model of international negotiation, can help us to think about how diplomats go about negotiating international agreements and the way in which science diplomacy can contribute to that. The other thing I want to point out to you in this content-based knowledge table here is this idea of both science and diplomacy being transnational epistemic communities, right? There's a lot of mobility and collaboration in the science world, just as there is in the world of diplomacy. So for those of you who are in Ottawa, where, you know, there are a large number of embassies. Many of those embassies have a science attaché. They have, you know, a diplomat whose focus is on science and science diplomacy. Those people are generally career diplomats who are moving around to different postings throughout the world, and they are often operating in 3-year postings. And so kind of thinking about, you know, if you're engaged in science diplomacy, having a better handle on the community, the epistemic community from which diplomats are, in which diplomats are members, is really quite useful. So I want to give you an example when it comes to the science of science diplomacy, an example of models and theories. And I'm going to give you an example from negotiation theory. And it's the model. Anybody who's taken international relations has probably learned about this. If you haven't, I'm going to share a little bit about this with you here in this lecture. It's the model of two-level games. And we're going to use the example of science diplomacy for energy and environment, which is what you've just been engaged in, to try to kind of think this through. So two-level games in negotiation theory are another kind of serious game. So you just participated in what is often referred to as a serious game with the simulation. Two-level games in negotiation theory are another way of thinking about games, but utilizing game theory. They were made prominent in an article published in 1988 by Robert Putnam in the premier journal of international relations, which is called International Organization. And he published this article called Diplomacy and Domestic Politics, the Logic of Two-Level Games. This article has been cited, you know, tens of thousands of times. It really spurred a lot of interest in international negotiation theory. This is often referred to also as double-edged diplomacy. And you'll see here I included the cover of a book that was edited by Robert Putnam and a number of collaborators a few years after that article was published. And basically what this theory does is to say that in international negotiations, what states are trying to do is attend to interests and imperatives at two levels, both the domestic level and also the international level. And so when it comes to an international agreement, which I suspect is what you were trying to come to in your simulation, international agreements then are about finding what are referred to as common windsets between states. So basically areas where they can satisfy not only the interests and imperatives at the global or international level, but also at the domestic level. And, you know, if you're engaged in science diplomacy, whether as a diplomat or a scientist, or you're working with an NGO or a company, or you name it, another organization, or part of a multilateral international organization, thinking about the negotiation of international agreements through this lens is really a powerful heuristic. So we're going to dive into it a little bit here so you can get a sense of how it works. If you're interested in this, I highly encourage you to just, you know, follow up some of these references, and there'll be more than enough for you to chew on there. So this will just be a bit of a teaser to that. So basically how this works is you've got, you know, the two levels, as I mentioned before. Again, if you're a government, let's say you're the Canadian government, you are, in the context of an international negotiation, engaging with your international counterparts. And so that clearly is other governments, but it can also be other international actors. It can be global NGOs. It can be NGOs from other countries. It can be, you know, corporations. It can be celebrities who are often engaged in international diplomacy and international relations. And that's the level one in this game. The second level is at the domestic level. And this is where you've got domestic actors. So again, companies, NGOs, subnational levels of government. So if you think about energy and climate, here you could imagine the Canadian government, negotiating internationally at the United Nations through the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some of the other key international actors would, of course, be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are global coalitions of companies, of NGOs, of climate activists, and you've got a whole host of international actors in this space. And then domestically, you've also got domestic actors, right? So you have provinces, you've got individual companies, indigenous communities, municipalities, industry associations, you name it. Any organization or entity or individual with an interest in energy and climate is at that second level domestically. And so if you're the Canadian government in an international negotiation, you're trying to get to an agreement internationally that will not only, satisfy international partners, but also satisfy domestic partners as well, which sounds easy in theory, but is much more challenging in practice. So the way that this theory conceptualizes this is that you've got a windset, as I mentioned a moment ago. So if you're, here on this kind of heuristic graph, if your A and B is two different governments, each of them have their sort of, universe of possibilities that would be of interest to both the international objectives, but also their domestic objectives. And really what governments are trying to do in these international negotiations is to identify a windset, so this narrow band, diagonal band in the middle, that satisfies both those domestic and international imperatives. And so you can begin to see why international negotiations, back to this question of time, take often a long time. So how does this actually work? And we're going to show you another couple of figures here. So how does this actually work in practice? So you were all just participating in a simulation. And so you were doing this sort of across the table negotiations, but also what's referred to as behind the table negotiations. So in this diagram, A and B are, individual governments that are negotiating with one another for some sort of international agreement. Could be a climate agreement, could be a trade agreement, could be something about Arctic shipping, take your pick. And they've got that, negotiation taking place so-called across the table at that level one. Level two then, which is sometimes referred to as behind the table, level two then is at that domestic level. And at the domestic level, all governments will have multiple actors and entities who are interested in the outcome of those negotiations and who have their own interests, right? That the agreement should look like X, or it should look like Y, or those who support the achievement of an agreement, or those who oppose the negotiation of an agreement. And so, governments are trying to work through all of these different imperatives and arrive at an agreement that will not only satisfy their international counterpart, but that can also be ratified domestically. So this idea of ratification is really important in this theory, because agreements are negotiated internationally and then they have to be ratified domestically in some way. And so there's a lot of attention paid in this theory to ratification procedures, which could be either, in Canada, depending on the kind of agreement, it can either be ratified just by cabinet. Some agreements have to go through Parliament. Some agreements require the provinces to come on board, or certainly they require the provinces to implement them. And as a result of that, the more entities that are involved in ratification, the more opportunities there are for, various players at that domestic level to try to influence the shape of an agreement. And, international agreements, if you are, let's say, the Canadian government, you want to have credibility with your international counterparts. So whatever agreement that you come to, you want to be assured that you can ratify that domestically. Otherwise, you lose credibility with your international counterparts. So how, this is a sort of standard game, and of course you can blow this up into, multiple governments negotiating, multiple supporters, opponents, and the like. So there are ways that you can play this game, quote unquote. And, it's not uncommon then for governments, when they are at those across the table negotiations. And negotiations are generally undertaken, as you probably saw through the simulation, they're not undertaken in public. There are elements that are public, but a lot of the actual nitty gritty of a negotiation is undertaken, in confidence, sort of behind closed doors. And one of the reasons for that is that governments are often sharing with one another the kinds of domestic pressures that they are, are under in that particular issue area. And so the way this slide is trying to demonstrate that, if you're government A, let's say you're the Canadian government, and let's say government B is the US government, and you're trying to negotiate an agreement around climate. And in the US, there is a particular domestic actor that has really strong views that, the US administration knows that they absolutely must address that issue in the agreement, or they will not be able to succeed at ratification of that agreement domestically. And, it's not uncommon then for governments to share that information in confidence with one another, and for the Canadian government then to be trying to work to help find an agreement that will satisfy both those, international, intergovernmental, across the border, the bilateral objectives, but also the domestic objectives of their counterpart across the table. And of course, this goes both ways, and it goes multiple directions. This is just a simple example here, but you could imagine, and this happens, and I suspect that you participated in some of this in the simulation as well, you could imagine, and this happens in practice, domestic actors who align with their foreign counterparts, so supporters of a particular aspect of an agreement, who form coalitions with supporters in other countries to try to push governments in a particular direction when it comes to the negotiation of an agreement. So this two-level approach to thinking about science diplomacy, is actually quite, I think, helpful as a heuristic when it comes to engaging in science diplomacy and getting a better understanding of the sorts of factors or imperatives or interests that governments are really trying to juggle and align when they are negotiating international agreements. So I want to conclude this talk by looking forward. And, if we are to transform decision-making, which we're going to need to do to effectively address the grand challenges of our time, science diplomacy, in my view, plays a really strong role in that context. So what are some of the things that we're going to need to do going forward to maximize the capacity for science diplomacy to play that role? So this is my final slide here, and I'm going to look forward to your comments and your questions. So a few thoughts and ideas. We really need, when it comes to grand challenges, and I think many scientists and certainly many of the emerging leaders that we work with at the Institute, they're not disciplinary focused, they're problem focused. They're looking at, I want to contribute to solving the grand challenge of X, and they want to work with others to do that. And so successfully addressing grand challenges really requires mobilizing and building a capacity across all forms of science diplomacy. So you'll remember again, we talked about science for diplomacy. So scientific cooperation to improve relations between countries. There may be issue areas or particular moments in time where various countries, the relationships between them are quite chilly, where they have a hard time sitting down across from one another at a negotiating table and collaborating on shared challenges. This can be a moment where science can play, and the relationships between science can help to pave the way to that. And I think, building capacity to do that will be extremely important in the years ahead. Also there, as we mentioned earlier in the talk, there's science in diplomacy, right? So informing foreign policy objectives with science advice and strengthening the capacity of foreign policy apparatuses. So whether it's at Global Affairs Canada here in Canada, or the international elements or sectors of individual government departments at the federal or provincial levels, to help inform their objectives with scientific advice, and building the capacity for them to receive that advice, and building the capacity for science to provide that advice. And that's not just advice coming from within government, it's coming from outside of government as well. There's diplomacy for science, right? So fostering international science cooperation. There are many areas where, a key objective is the need for mission-driven global science on the issues. And that, again, is an opportunity for scientists to be working together globally on shared challenges, and with the support of their national or subnational governments. And then, of course, what we've been talking about in the talk here today, the science of science diplomacy. So better understanding what are some of the models and theories and methods of science diplomacy practice, teaching, and training. So what does this mean in practice? Well, at least 3 things, and probably many more that I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on in the Q&A session. One of which is building greater awareness across government, business, civil society, and the academy of the value of science diplomacy. I think it's really, surprising, for lack of a better word, that there has only recently been attention to science diplomacy. Science diplomacy has been happening, since there was science and since there were governments. Science diplomacy has been happening, but it's only emerged as a term and as an area of study over the last few decades. So we really don't know that much about it, and there isn't necessarily the awareness that there could be amongst a whole host of actors of the value of science diplomacy. It also means expanding science diplomacy teaching and training. This, again, is another area. I alluded to it at the outset of the talk. There really are very few opportunities. I mean, I think, one could look out there and see, yes, there are opportunities. I'm not saying that there aren't opportunities, but there need to be more opportunities to learn about science diplomacy. And that's, within universities, outside universities, summer schools, simulation exercises like the one that you participated in today. That really needs to be expanded. And then, enhancing knowledge about the science of science diplomacy. And here I would give a special nod, as it were, to the engagement of social scientists in this area. Because again, I think there has tended to be a bit of a silo between those who are engaged in the practice of science diplomacy and who've written about it, who have done some of this work in the science of science diplomacy, but there hasn't necessarily been as much connection or engagement or collaboration with people in the social sciences, notably in international relations, to really further and mobilize some of the existing theories and models of international relations to the benefit of science diplomacy. So I gave you an example here today with the two-level games, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There would be multiple opportunities to do that. And I think the final thing, and this is where I want to end, is emerging scientific and diplomatic leaders, and that's all of you here today and many, many more, I think can play a really crucial role in this process in terms of the building that awareness, calling for and organizing the opportunities for that science teaching and training, getting involved in research that helps to learn more about the science of science diplomacy, and really, shaking it up to try to ensure that we maximize the capacity for science diplomacy to help us globally and domestically to successfully address grand challenges. So I will end there, and I look forward very much to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was getting your inputs and your perspectives on such a timely topic. It's been really educational. I